Every second was filled with blood, screeching, and fear. The boy shook in terror as pieces of flesh flew across his limited vision, but he must contain himself. Even a squirm, a blink, a breath can cost his life. From the slit in the closet door he watched. He watched until the head turned and the evil eye glared straight into his. Shiro, we're heading to the bar right now of the other departments. You coming?
Dr. Ryu?
He sounded a bit startled, as if he had just awoken from a deep sleep.
I'm afraid I have some clients to take care of tonight. Please don't mind me. Enjoy your time.
Oh, you're sure a formalist like others say, the doctor commented. Are you sure? You deserve some leisure time. You worked very, very hard this whole week, huh?
Thank you, sir. But I'm sure you're better off without my boring self.
His right cheek lifted awkwardly as words left his mouth. You crazy, crazy kid, the doctor joked. He was responded with a dead silence, followed by an eerie smile.
As the hour hand slowly inched to strike 11 on the clock for the second time that day, all there was in the doctor's office was a young man in his early 20s, sitting almost motionlessly in his desk. In 21st century Japan, people his age would be partying and socializing every available second, but this man was different. Upon closer glance, his hands were scribbling rapidly with the already dulled pencil as the wind outside howled and roared, smashing endless beams of rain onto the brittle pieces of glass beside him. Written across the name tag on his laboratory coat was Dr. Kuroya Shiro. Like most other young doctors, Kuroya spent most of his free time reviewing the properties of every fragile and fatal vein in the human body. But unlike any others, his knowledge was not gained upon the urge to heal, but the thought of murder and revenge. He was not mad. Well, that's what he chose to believe. Crazy people knew nothing, he thought, and if that's the case, he would not be so clear of his intentions. For the past week, he's had his eyes on the old man. Kuroya loved this man. Since his 5th birthday, this was the only person to provide him the warmth of family, but he needs to die. Kuroya has been more attentive to him that week than ever before, from offering assistance with groceries to keeping him in company once he's free from work. Then every midnight, he would stealthily walk to the old man's chamber door. He'd open a decent-sized crack in the door and thrust one of his hands through swiftly, hoping the flashlight wouldn't hit anything and wake the old man, before peeking his head through the small space with care and caution. It was an hour before he placed his whole head in, and when he did, he praised himself with how cunningly he was while doing so. No madman would have been so wise. As he glanced through the dark, the beam of light from the flashlight shone right on what he referred to as the vulture eye. But he saw that it was closed. It was impossible to complete the deed, for it was not the old man that he had a problem with, but his eye. Kuroya repeated his ritual of acting more attentive just to the absolute fullest, then sneaking in to find the perfect time for murder for the past 7 days and nights.
But this was the 8th night, and he was more cautious tonight than any of the others. The minute hand on the grandfather of the clock was moving faster than Kuroya. He had never felt so right in his judgment and so empowered before that he could scarcely contain his feelings of triumph. To think that this old man would never have even contemplate what he might do next. Just the pure thought made Kuroya chuckle under his breath, which made the old man move on his bed suddenly, alarmed to hear a human-like sound which was not his own. But this was not enough for Kuroya to draw back. Instead, he enlarged the gap in the door, since the man was definitely not able to see as well as he could. The room was swallowed in darkness. Not even the moonlight could peek through, for all the windows were covered by both blinds and curtains. Finally, he pushed his head in once more and tried to turn on the flashlight, but dropped it in front of him. The old man sat up, startled, lost, but he was courageous enough to call out, "Who's there?" Neither of them moved a muscle, at least for another hour or so. The clock continued rotating its hands before a light groan broke the silence. Kuroya knew that the old man was terrified. His fear must be building up minute by minute, second by second. It was the sound that only arises from the bottom of one's soul when overcharged with awe. Kuroya only knows that sound too well, for this dreadful echo would wake him up in the terror every single night. And it was all the man's fault. He pitied him, although chuckling at heart.
On the bed, the old man shook and comforted himself with the thought of the sound just being a cricket, but he would later find that these thoughts are all in vain. All in vain because death is approaching him. It stalked his shadow and will soon engulf the victim. Very patiently, Kuroya waited. Without hearing the man lie down, he resolved to turn the flashlight on stealthily until a dim ray, like the thread of a spider, rested upon the evil eye. Kuroya was pleased but also furious to see it being open wide open. The eye was covered in a hideous veil of blue. Gladly, nothing else could be seen on the old man's face or body, for the dim ray laid precisely on the damned spot. He only knew this eye way too well, for it matched the very one that belonged to the murderer of his parents, for it has haunted him since the age of 5.
What others mistake as madness within Kuroya is just acuteness of the sense, as suddenly there came to his ears a low, pulsing sound. It was the beating of the man's heart. It strengthened and increased his fury just as the beating of drums stimulated a soldier into war. This was the man that gave birth to the murderer. But even then he refrained his movement and breath. The old man had never wronged him. In fact, it was him that protected and saved his life of only 5 years. But it was also him that allowed the demon to fled. He could have been dead already for all Kuroya cared, but revenge needed to take place. He knew that blood needed to be shed in front of him. Meanwhile, the hellish sound of the heart grew quicker and quicker and louder and louder. The old man's terror must have been extreme. Kuroya was nervous, very dreadfully nervous, and now an anxiety seized him as the breathing continued to increase. He could no longer think rationally, for all he could focus on was that the sound would be heard by a neighbor.
With a scream, he hurled the flashlight across the floor and leapt into the room. The man shrieked for the last time before a hand reached for the fatal vein in his throat. In an instant, Kuroya pulled the heavy bed over him. He smiled. The deed was finally done. He considered how remorse may overtake him, but nothing matters anymore. Finally, the beating ceased, and upon examining the corpse, Kuroya was certain that there was no pulsation. The eye would haunt him no more. He denies again that he is mad, for the wise precautions that he took for concealing the body was incredible. With a chainsaw, he slowly disassembled the old man's body in a tub. Piece by piece, he deposited them under the planks from the flooring of the chamber. No stain could be found anywhere after he rinsed the last bits of blood from his hands, into the tub, down the drain. Genius, he thought. It was nearly 4 when the cleanup was finished, but it was still dark as midnight. As the clock struck the hour, there came a knocking at his door. Kuroya opened it with a light heart. "What do I hear now?" he whispered to himself. There entered 2 men. With perfect suavity, they introduced themselves as the police force in the area.
Ming, this is the police.
Hello, Mr. Shiro. A shriek has been heard by your neighbors moments ago that we have been deputed to search your premises since there may be a suspicion of foul play.
Kuroya smiled. "Please come in." He then led them through the house, as he explained. "The scream was only from my nightmare. The old man I live with? He is absent in the country." At last they arrived in the old man's chamber. Kuroya, in the wild audacity of his perfect triumph, brought chairs into the room and placed his upon the very spot of the hidden corpse. The officers suspected nothing. Kuroya's manners had convinced them. He answered each question cheerfully as they chatted of various things. But as time passed, Kuroya found that he wished them gone. His head began aching, and he merely felt a ringing in his ears. He began to talk in more attempt of discharging this feeling of unease, but it only increased until he believed that the noise was not only within his mind. He grew pale. He felt sick, but he continued to talk more fluently and with a heightened voice. Yet the sound only increased. It was a low, pulsing sound, much like the beating of a drum that stimulated a soldier into war. Kuroya gasped for breath, but it seemed like the officers could not hear a thing. The noise only steadily increased. He began pacing the floor to and fro with heavy strides. The noise only steadily increased. He raved, he swore, he swung his chair, and it scraped against the floor. The noise only steadily increased. It grew, and it grew, and it grew. But still the officers chatted pleasantly and smiled. No, they must have heard. Kuroya shook in fright. They must have known. They must be mocking his horror. Kuroya decided that anything was better than this agony, than those hypocritical smiles. He could bear it no longer. The noise only steadily increased. Louder, louder, louder. "Demons!" at last he shrieked. "I admit the murder. Here, under the planks, is the beating of his hideous heart."